Parting Ways, Part 2 of 5, The Emergence of Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, a Jewish Jesus movement, and the fight over Torah law. Part 1 ended with Judaism making a pivot. It lost the one place where sacrifice, priesthood, and national symbolism could be performed in public, and it relocated its authority into something you can carry: text, law, argument, a culture of disciplined dispute that would be able to survive foreign rule and distance. In Part 2, we examine the point where the Jesus community was alive, but Christianity, as a separate social body, had not yet fully formed. The movement was still Jewish in personnel, instinct, and imagination. It read Israel's scriptures as its own, argued the way Jews argue, and fought about how to implement Torah rather than whether Torah is relevant. Jesus and his first followers were not trying to exit Judaism, they were trying to win an argument inside it. And the argument sounded internal. Rival readings of scripture, rival claims to authority, rival accounts of what serving God looks like when God intervenes in history, acting now. We do not see this movement through a neutral lens. Our earliest Christian writings are Paul's letters, written in the 50s CE, to adjudicate live disputes in communities forming across the empire. The Gospels came later, shaped by decades of preaching, memory, and conflict. The Book of Acts is later still, written by the author of the Gospel of Luke. It reads as a well-crafted origin story, with clear theological aims alongside whatever history it preserves. Within the New Testament, each document is responding to a different social problem in a different kind of community. Jesus belonged to the early 1st century. Paul is writing in the 50s. Mark is often placed around 70. Matthew and Luke come later in the 1st century, and Acts sits alongside Luke. John is late 1st century, possibly edging into the early 2nd. How Jewish were they, really? Jesus died circa 33 CE. In the 30s and 40s CE, the movement was overwhelmingly Jewish. Jerusalem was the center. The temple was still the focal point, Torah was the constitution, and the disputes were Jewish disputes. Even Paul, who went on to shape how Gentile followers would engage with Jewish law, was a Jew in argument with other Jews about Torah. Reading backwards, it is tempting to picture two finished camps, Judaism on one side and Christianity on the other, facing off. In the earliest decades, you are watching Jews argue about what being Jewish looks like with the arrival of a messianic era, with outsiders beginning to gather around the edges. The movement lived in physical spaces and in Jewish ritual. Temple courts in Jerusalem, synagogues and Jewish meeting houses in diaspora cities, homes and courtyards, workshops, shared meals, scripture read aloud and argued over in real time. Interpretive fights assumed shared texts with other Jews and shared instincts, even when conflicts became stark. Writing in the 50s, Paul was sending letters around the Eastern Mediterranean. He was still thinking in Jewish terms, drawing on Jewish scripture, and treating the God of Israel as the only God in town. The God he proclaims is Israel's God, and Israel's story remained the frame he refused to leave behind. So the early question was rarely, will people follow Jesus instead of Moses? It was closer to, what does adherence to the law of Moses look like if you think the Messiah has arrived, the end times are close, and Israel's God is acting now? That is why the arguments felt like family arguments. The tone was sharp because the claim was sharp. We are reading Torah properly in the messianic moment, and Israel's story is turning. What Torah means here. Modern Gentile readers hear Torah and often imagine either a legal code or a pile of rituals. For Second Temple Jews, Torah was scripture. It was Israel's covenant memory, calendar, food, sex, kinship, purity rules, and the daily practices that persisted across generations. Food and circumcision were where theology met continuity, bodies, households, honor, Roman scrutiny, and the fear of being consumed by the empire. That richness is why the dispute between these rival Jewish groups heated up quickly. Interpretation was one thing, a shared life was another. In this period, Torah disputes often decided whether you could share a table with each other at all. Apocalyptic air. Late Second Temple Judaism contained a lot of end-of-the-age expectation through multiple facets: deliverance, a final judgment of the nations, God's decisive intervention. These are reflected in the Book of Daniel, Enochic traditions, 4th Ezra, and a host of other non-canonical texts from the era. The sense of imminence of the end times was palpable and changed the tenor of how people understood and argued Torah. When a crucified Messiah was added to the mix, the pressure spiked. Scripture was reread and re-understood. Israel's story had to be explained in a way that could hold disaster without collapsing into despair. Inside that world, it was not a slow academic process. It was an interpretive emergency. Jesus' followers had to deal with the challenge of what do you do with the concept of Messiah once their Messiah has been publicly executed by Rome. Matthew's Jesus. Torah intensified, not discarded. More so than the others, Matthew's is the gospel that makes the Jewishness of the dispute crystal clear. In Matthew, Jesus is explicit that his followers must keep Jewish law and keep it better than the scribes and Pharisees. The polemic is aimed at the hypocrisy and authority of the Pharisees, not at their interpretation of the law. The message was, do as they say, not as they do. Matthew's Sermon on the Mount opens with a programmatic claim. Jesus had not come to abolish the law but to fulfill it, and not the smallest part will pass away until all is accomplished. Righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, so the contrast in Matthew is not Moses versus Jesus. Matthew did not frame them as rival loyalty figures. The argument stayed internal. Who is faithful to Torah in the Messianic time? Matthew raised the bar on what commitment to Torah looks like. When Jesus starts handling specific laws, he does not loosen them, he makes them stricter. You've heard it said, do not murder. Don't even feel angry towards someone. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery. Don't even think about a married woman. That move sits comfortably inside rabbinic moral reasoning. The Torah is treated as the arena of faithfulness, with the fight focused on interpretation, intention, and integrity. Matthew can read like a text trying to double down on Jewish law, while everything around it is in flux. Matthew's ambiguity about Gentiles. Matthew was clear that law was supreme, but he does not usually specify what he meant by the law in practical terms, and it is not completely clear whether he thought Gentiles must keep everything in it. Torah was ethics, and it was also identity and boundary. Torah contained markers that make Jews Jews in the ancient world: circumcision, Sabbath, food laws, purity habits, festivals. They were not abstract ideals. They marked bodies, time, kitchens, and tables. They drew a line through ordinary life. So if Gentiles joined the new Jewish messianic movement, what was to happen? Should Gentiles join by becoming Jews, taking on the covenant markers? Or could there be a new category, Gentiles attached to Israel's God and to Israel's Messiah, while remaining Gentiles? Circumcision was not a light endeavor. It was surgery, and it carried pain, risk, stigma, and belonging. A covenant sign etched into flesh. In a Greco-Roman setting, it also carried social costs. Male nudity in gym culture made circumcision visible. It could mark you as alien, as someone opting out of dominant ideals of citizenship, masculinity, and honor. So, must Gentiles be circumcised? Was also, do we expect Gentile men to pay a lasting cost in the majority world? And it was, can Jewish followers of Jesus treat uncircumcised men as full covenant partners at the table? Once Gentiles arrived in serious numbers, the movement had to decide what it is in practice, in the daily practice of community. The Gentile problem. The Jesus movement seemed to have delayed the decision for a while, retaining an ambivalence. It papered over it with local arrangements. It was acting as a Jewish renewal movement with a few sympathetic outsiders. But daily mechanics forced the question. Conversion was one pressure point. Table fellowship was another. All of this happened under Roman rule, in cities where public religion was inseparable from civic life, where voluntary associations were watched, and where Jewish distinctness was tolerated in one decade and treated as suspect in another. After revolt and repression, anything that looked like Jewish separatism could draw attention. Anything that looked like Jewish assimilation could look like disappearance. So an internal dispute about Torah was also an argument about how to live under power without being crushed or dissolved. Table fellowship was where it stopped being theoretical, because it was where multiple issues arose. A mixed group could agree on lofty slogans more easily than it could agree on what to eat, where the food came from, what to do about meat, whether the wine was acceptable, and what a shared meal did to boundaries that had helped Jews remain a distinct people under empire. Eating together, purity, idolatry, and pagan food, Paul described a rupture in Galatians that was almost aggressively concrete. Peter has been eating with Gentiles in Antioch, then withdrew when certain men came from James. James, being a Jerusalem leader, identified in the tradition as Jesus' brother. Paul confronted him. You can see the conflict in the bodily awkwardness of it, eating, withdrawing, and the public signal that the withdrawal sent. Antioch provides a useful mental image because it was a big diaspora city where a mixed Jewish-Gentile community existed, and because it had a thriving pagan social life. Gentile life was saturated with idols through civic festivals, guild feasts, household shrines, meat that had passed through temples, wine poured to gods. A dinner after a guild meeting, a family celebration with a libation, a casual purchase from a butcher whose supply chain ran through a shrine. Even if a Gentile believer said, sincerely, "I have turned to Israel's God," the marketplace is still the marketplace. What does it mean to live non-idolatrously when the whole economy is spiritually sticky? These questions later sparked an entire volume of rabbinic law relating to interactions with idol worshippers. Rabbinic discussions would connect food and wine restrictions to fear of social mixing, intermarriage, and assimilation. Even without importing later texts wholesale into the 40s and 50s, the undercurrents are easy to recognize. Meals create intimacy, and intimacy dissolves boundaries. Under empire, blurred boundaries can threaten the slow loss of a people. That is the background to Antioch. If Peter is eating with Gentiles, what food is being served? Who prepared it? What social world does it carry with it? Is it entangled, directly or indirectly, with idol sacrifice? Is the table pulling Jews into a system Jewish law treats as contaminating? Paul did not respond by sneering at purity. He reframes belonging. If Gentiles have been brought in by God, you cannot treat them as second class at the table without turning God's own desire into a lie. The Jewish sensitivity to these matters is, in the rabbinic view, what kept marriages in the family. They kept children inside the group. They kept social and religious memories intact. When the Jesus movement began to soften these lines, alarm bells went off in other parts of the Jewish people who thought they were guarding covenant loyalty itself. Acts 15 and the shape of compromise. The book of Acts presented a set-piece resolution. A council in Jerusalem decided Gentiles do not need circumcision, but must keep a short list of prohibitions. This became known as the Apostolic Decree. The list was a snapshot of what they saw as the pressure points. It was not a generic moral code. It focused on practices that make shared life hard in a mixed setting: idolatry and food contamination, blood and sexual conduct. Acts' demand was that followers abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from porneia. Porneia could mean various forms of sexual immorality, including illicit unions the Torah forbids. Whatever you make of Acts as history, a widely debated field, it preserves a social impulse. The movement is trying to keep mixed communities possible while keeping Jewish believers within a Torah-styled life. Acts reads like a different genre from Paul. Paul was writing into live conflict, trying to stop communities splitting while the argument was still hot. Acts was writing later, looking backwards, trying to tell a coherent story about how unity was possible. The Apostolic Decree also sits next to Jewish patterns of thought about Gentiles attached to Israel's God without full conversion. Rabbinic Judaism would later articulate Noahide laws, a category for Gentiles who worship Israel's God without conversion, as a baseline for non-Jews and a moral minimum for the righteous among the nations. Acts 15 can read like an example of the same concept. Gentiles can attach themselves without becoming Jews, but they must sever the practices most tightly bound up with pagan worship, blood, and sexual disorder. Scholars argue about how direct that connection is. One plausible frame is Leviticus 17-18 and the Ger Toshev model, the resident alien category in Leviticus for a Gentile living among Israel and bound by a limited set of prohibitions. Read that way, Acts is trying to make shared life possible without asking Jewish believers to abandon Torah, a practical flaw for holiness in a mixed community. Paul, as the accelerant, Paul did not invent the Gentile question. The wider Jewish world already contained Gentiles in Jewish orbit: synagogue attenders, God-fearers, people attracted to Jewish ethics and Jewish monotheism. Outsiders could be nearby without fully coming in. However, Paul forced a decision. He insisted that Gentiles can belong without circumcision and without taking on full Torah observance. That shifted the center of gravity, especially later, as the Jesus community became a major Gentile grouping. From a distance, Paul often read as the man who universalized Judaism into Christianity. In his own view, he is doing something else. The nations turning to Israel's God is Israel's story reaching its moment in history, bound up with the Messiah having come. That time pressure ran through his advice: stay where you are. requiring conversion from Gentiles, misreads what God was doing at that moment in history. You can also see why this reads, to some Torah-observant Jesus-following Jews, as betrayal. Even if Paul believed he was honoring Scripture, even if he believed he was reading Abraham and Moses correctly, even if he saw himself as fighting paganism rather than accommodating it, the lived result still looked like drift away from Torah observance. And drift is not an abstract fear. It was visible in kitchens, in marriages, in how children were raised, in which calendar the household was to follow, in whether a Jewish believer could eat in a Gentile home without judgment, and in whether Jewish believers slowly stopped living as Jews because the mixed environment made Jewish practice socially expensive. This was the seed of the later split that was retold as theology. It was also a clash of instincts about continuity, what kept a small people intact under an empire, and what happened when a movement born inside that minority identity was about to scale through a majority world. Gospel drift, from internal dispute to boundary marking. You can feel the temperature change in the texts as decades pass. In the earliest written gospel, Mark preserved a dispute about purity and then added an editorial gloss that, at minimum, made the table easier to defend in mixed settings. Whatever that line meant at the time, it became the kind of sentence later communities could reach for when mixed life kept generating the same crisis. Matthew, by contrast, doubled down on Torah observance and casts Jesus as its intensifier. Later layers, e.g. Luke, John, and Acts, are told with more distance, for communities where the other side was less likely to be your brother or cousin in the next synagogue. Over time, the polemic hardened. They started to sound like a category rather than a member of the family. Once the community was used to reading the dispute as us versus them, rather than one argument inside Israel, they were moving towards the later world where Jews would become a theological other rather than a living community next door. A movement that began as a Jewish messianic project was now split internally on the Gentile question. Acts preserved a compromise. Paul preserved an argument that refused a two-tier table. Jewish boundary anxiety was not a moral failure. It was a long-standing fear of assimilation, expressed in covenant and holiness language, reinforced by history and power. At this point, the separation was not yet complete. The fight was still somewhat internal. The scriptures were still shared. The language remained recognizably Jewish. But the mechanism of separation was already working away. Part 3 picks up when that unresolved tension became a simple numerical reality. Once the default member was no longer Jewish, the Torah stops being lived knowledge and starts being something the movement has to translate from the outside. At that point, the meaning of Torah, Israel, covenant, and us could not stay the same.